When she wrote her book, The Quiet Damage, the journalist Jesselyn Cook said she wanted to open people's minds to a different way of thinking about those who believe in outlandish conspiracies or radical ideologies. Yes, they can seem like lunatics, and yes, some of this stuff is offensive and racist, but Cook employs empathy as a tool to understand why people latch onto this bonkers stuff. And she tells the story through the experiences of 5 different families whose lives were ripped apart by the QAnon conspiracy theory. One of them is Adam's.
As a little boy, Adam adored his father. He looked up to his father like a hero. He was this very successful man, provided a lot for his family, gave them a beautiful life and a rural home in the South. Adam wanted to be just like him. And then tragedy strikes this family. Adam and his sisters aren't aware of this at the time, but his dad has a very serious gambling problem. And when his father loses a really devastating bet, he ends up taking his own life. This completely shatters all the children, but Adam especially had this very close connection to his dad. And in this really dark time, he develops this new, very beautiful relationship with his mother, Emily. She has been a stay-at-home mom for a really long time, but she realizes she needs to provide for her kids, so she ultimately goes to school and becomes a lawyer. Eventually, his 2 older sisters go off to college, and it's just Adam and his mom, Emily, at home. And they become just best friends. And he decides he wants to follow in her footsteps. He wants to grow up and become a lawyer just like she is. And so he too goes off to law school eventually and really wants to just carry on this torch that she set, following in her example. But as he gets older, his mom kind of transforms into someone he no longer recognizes. And their relationship falls apart when she tumbles down this conspiracy theory rabbit hole. So Adam and his sisters have noticed for a little while that their mom has been drifting rightward. She actually votes for Donald Trump in 2016, which is shocking to everyone. They notice that when they go home to visit her, she's watching Fox News, but they haven't realized just how deep into this world she's gone. And so finally, there are signs that she's in QAnon. Her kids see her adopt anti-immigrant rhetoric. They see her embrace some of the white supremacist elements of QAnon. They see her spouting even anti-Semitic rhetoric. And so she's really just done a 180 from a woman they've known to be kind and caring and accepting and very, very smart. She's a brilliant woman, to someone who pivots into a world of delusions and hate and hysteria. And when she realizes that her son, Adam, when he has voted for Joe Biden in the 2020 election, she's disgusted with him. And she sends him this absolutely vicious email, like violently cruel.
"Pain is coming for you," she promised. "And your beloved China Joe, fraud Obama, and his man-wife Michael." She called Adam a monster, a huge disappointment, and an utter embarrassment. He was no child of hers, she declared, just a spoiled, evil brat who deserved to suffer for his choices. She claimed that he wouldn't survive the bombshells that would soon shatter his faux reality, that he'd end up like Dan. "Shed my DNA," Emily wrote, twisting the dagger. "I am done with you."
For Adam, this really destroys him. He starts spiraling into gambling addiction himself. He stops taking care of himself. He stops performing well at work. His whole sense of self is shattered because they are so closely bonded and connected through his childhood that to lose her is just more than he can possibly bear. You know, before I wrote this book, I really wasn't seeing any reporting on the social causes or outcomes of conspiracy theories. But Emily's story was so fascinating to me because When you ask someone what they think of QAnon or of a conspiracy theorist, they'll tell you, to believe something like that, you must be really stupid. But Emily was not that. She's brilliant. She put herself through law school. She was a very successful lawyer for a time before her life unraveled. And I wanted to understand, how did this happen? How did such a smart, sharp woman come undone in this way? I interviewed hundreds of families afflicted by this for my research, and the common thread was not about intelligence. People had these unmet human needs that QAnon in some way fulfilled. And Emily went through this extraordinary trauma. And so she had all of this immense anger and no real outlet for that. And a lot of people have a kind of sense of hardship for very legitimate reasons. And so when you're watching something like Fox News and when you're kind of making that leap toward QAnon, when you're constantly being fed this narrative that you are a victim of the establishment, it becomes so much easier to adopt anti-establishment conspiracy theories that kind of solidify that view. They give you a place for your anger, and they give you vindication that you have been wronged in some way. So Emily really found a home for her anger in QAnon.
This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Jesselyn Cook is with us for the hour to help explain the psychological and emotional factors that deepen belief. She writes about how trauma and isolation help explain why people get hooked on these wild beliefs, but also how there's this collective vulnerability we need to recognize and reckon with. Cook told us this all began when she attended a rally, a PACT rally in Los Angeles. This was in 2020. It was a QAnon event where some followers had brought their kids. And it prompted her to write an article about what happens to children whose parents fall deep into these conspiracy worlds. And she says the article absolutely took off.
The reaction I got to that piece was unlike anything I had ever received. The story ended up going viral, and my inbox just exploded with hundreds and hundreds of emails from people all over the U.S. and beyond with their own stories of having loved ones kind of either deep down that path or headed in that direction, where they were starting to spout off QAnon conspiracy theories, anti-vax conspiracy theories, flat earth conspiracy theories, just all kinds of stuff. And so at this moment, I really started to understand the scope of the problem. And I was just, I kind of sat there with my head in my hands, scrolling through all these emails, reading through all this heartbreak, and realizing that I couldn't really do this story justice in an article.
One of the things you say you wanted to do with the book, and this is how you put it, is you wanted to recover some of these people from the realm of the other.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so little empathy and compassion for people who go down this road. And it's complicated. It's difficult. I understand that, not just because conspiracy theories can be absurd, but because they can often be really hateful. Yeah. And so it's a really touchy subject. And many of the families that I wrote about are grappling with how to accept or not accept the new versions of their loved ones. But I wanted to increase empathy by trying to say, it's not necessarily the insanity or the hatefulness that drew people down these paths. A lot of people become vulnerable for reasons that could happen to any of us. I don't think any person is immune to this way of thinking, no matter how smart they are, no matter how confident they are in their own critical thinking skills. I just saw again and again and again that people you would never expect end up way down the rabbit hole.
The other thing you say you want to do with the book is to open our minds, that is the readers, to a different way of thinking about the crisis. Talk about how you want people to think about this differently, because it kind of gets to a really important theme in the book, which is you're right, fact-checking. And even like media literacy training and regulations and policy related to tech, that's never going to be enough. What is the way you want us to think about this differently then?
People who have been trying to pull their loved ones out of conspiracy theories go into it in a really rational way. They often try to fact check and debunk and kind of shake their loved ones out of thinking like this. And coming at QAnon level conspiracy theories with facts is treating the symptom, not the cause. At the end of the day, this isn't really about true or false. And the people who really become extreme conspiracy theorists truly aren't actually preoccupied with what is true, even if they may call themselves truth tellers. People don't necessarily latch onto conspiracies like this because they want to get to what's true or what's real. It's not about what they think. It's about how conspiracy theories make them feel. If someone is finding in QAnon a community that accepts them and looks to them as a hero and looks to them as someone who's doing real good, you need to understand what it is what need that they're having met inside QAnon. So I would say I would like people to put aside the what of conspiracy theory belief, put aside the actual theories and the falsehoods and all the stuff you're tempted to debunk. Just put that aside and instead focus on the why. Yeah. Why does this person want to believe so badly? What deeper need is QAnon or whatever conspiracy theory they're embracing? What need is that satisfying? And start there.
How much of what you wanted to understand when you were reporting this book was about the particular dynamics of the QAnon phenomenon, which is surreal and fascinating and strange? And how much, though, was the larger question of how people can slip into theories that are kind of like it? Beyond the obvious particulars, is the QAnon conspiracy theory, really that different from other outlandish theories that have made their way through American popular culture? So it's not just about QAnon. It's about stuff like QAnon.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a very, very long history of conspiracy theories and mass delusions that, go back centuries longer. But QAnon, when I started writing this book, it had just exploded and it was really just at the front of my mind. But it absolutely... It does predate QAnon. It will go on past QAnon, that people are kind of jumping from healthy skepticism to reflexive suspicion. I don't even necessarily think of my book as being about QAnon. I do think QAnon it's a stand-in for really any kind of belief system that is not based in fact. It's based a lot more in emotion than logic, and it's really an obsessive way of thinking.
Tell us about Matt. Matt's one of the stories that you tell, and maybe this can get us to it seems like, and this is kind of true for Alice, who we'll come back to, it all starts with this video that they're maybe dubious about at first, but something about it catches their eye and something about it makes them just go deep into the rabbit hole. But talk about Matt's particular story.
Matt, in some ways, is a little more like, I guess, your stereotypical conspiracy theorist or QAnon believer. He was a Republican. He's a religious guy. He's a Trump supporter, a father to 2 young kids. He's been married for some time to his high school sweetheart. And his life kind of changes really in a major way when he suffers this injury to his groin out of nowhere. And it upends his life. He suddenly loses the ability to take care of himself and to take care of his family in the ways he used to. He's suddenly stuck in a chair most days. It's disabled him in a way that he's still trying to figure out. And so he was someone who got a lot of his purpose from being a stand-up dad, being a really involved and active husband and parent. And now he's having to kind of have his wife take over all the household labor, having to take the kids to and from school, having to, bring him his dinner on a plate in his armchair every day because he can't get up to do these things himself. And so this, in a very profound way, shatters his sense of self. And so Matt, he has encountered conspiracy theories before. He's kind of laughed at them. He's never really entertained them. But in this more vulnerable state where he's just kind of hanging on day by day, he's on Facebook one afternoon, and he comes across this video called The Plan to Save the World. Yeah. And he's bored. He's curious. He clicks on it. And this video is a really, really fascinating and powerful piece of QAnon propaganda. It was an entryway into the movement for so many early recruits into QAnon. It racked up millions of views on YouTube before it was eventually purged, like most other QAnon content. But it essentially tells this really compelling story about how the most powerful people in the world are secretly pulling the strings from behind the scenes. They're controlling the economy. They're keeping ordinary people from succeeding. They're kind of amassing all this wealth to themselves. And, there are some more extreme parts of this video, but it's a lot more palatable than your typical QAnon stuff. It's kind of like the hors d'oeuvre. It gets you thinking. And, Matt, his family, he and his wife, Andrea, they've always kind of been getting by paycheck to paycheck. Mm-hmm. They've always been struggling to pay their bills. Matt's always lived life by the books. He was raised religious. He gets married. He has kids. He's working. He's doing his best. And he's never really able to get ahead. And so in this video, he's fed this narrative basically saying it's not your fault. The system is designed to keep you down and to keep the elites up. You will never be able to afford the life you want, no matter how hard you work. The system is rigged against you. And so this is really vindicating for him. But, what it does is not flip Matt into a QAnon believer on the spot. It just kind of plants this seed of doubt in his mind. Like, a lot of what's being said in this video doesn't really sound like a conspiracy theory. It kind of relates to my life as I know it. And so what kind of ushers him down the path towards the more extreme stuff, he does go all the way down the rabbit hole and get toward the really, really wild theories gradually, is YouTube's algorithm. After he watches this one video, YouTube serves him a dozen more. And they are progressively extreme. They are hosted by these QAnon influencers who are just like ordinary people, an ordinary guy on your screen kind of talking to you like a friend. And Matt really starts to relate to some of the QAnon influencers he's seeing on his screens. They seem a lot friendlier and more accessible than the news anchors on TV. And he feels that they're more trustworthy. And he develops kind of these parasocial relationships with them where he's just coming to see them as familiar and trustworthy. And so Matt starts kind of very privately consuming a lot of this content, and then very obsessively consuming a lot of this content because it's so captivating to him. And he had always grown up playing a lot of video games where, you kind of have a bunch of players in some make-believe world working toward a common goal. And he saw real parallels with QAnon because QAnon was this very participatory movement where he and other ordinary people all over the place were kind of coming together online to look for intel, to support Donald Trump and Q, this mysterious figure at the center of the movement, to support them in this mission of bringing the deep state to its knees and restoring peace and prosperity to the world.
One thing you write about the way Matt is seeing this is it wasn't a spectator sport, that you could just look from the sidelines. It gave him this invitation to be part of something bigger than himself. And the idea of purpose is a really important one. It seems to be, for Matt, the idea of finding purpose, for finding something. Is that a hole that Matt and others are filling with QAnon in particular?
Yes, it was so alluring to Matt because at this stage in his life, when he feels as if he doesn't really know who he is anymore, he's lost his role as a father and as a husband in the ways he's always known. He can't provide in those ways. Suddenly, the door kind of opens again and QAnon is there and he has a way to be a digital soldier. That's what QAnon believers like to call themselves. And so suddenly he has this mission, this secret mission where he gets to be part of this big collective movement of patriots who are working together to make the world a better place. And that to him, it just makes him feel whole again. He'd been feeling so small, so lost, and it just extends this olive branch and he grabs on with both hands and starts to rebuild his identity inside this movement.
Will you tell this story about – there's this moment where Matt feels like he's had this epiphany that something has been confirmed. It's this idea of these mysterious seismic waves that are circling the globe in these kind of pulses. And people share a legit article about this because something happened, and it's from National Geographic, and it confirms something in Matt. He thinks he's having an epiphany, but then you write about what he's actually having is an epiphany. which is something else. And I think you do this throughout the book, sort of talking about these actual sort of ideas that help us explain what's going on. Do you mind talking a little bit about this?
Yeah. So, Q will put out these kind of weird things to like, what's the cause behind this? And Anons, these people like Matt, will try to dig for clues and meanings. And so in this case, there had been this seismic wave activity that had rippled around the globe. It was a real thing. It wasn't made up. As he said, there was a National Geographic article about it. And it just so happened that these waves were at intervals of 17 seconds. And yes, the 17th letter of the alphabet is Q. And to Matt, this was just this shocking revelation. It was, wow, like 17 seconds. Wow, 17 means Q. And, what does that mean? So what? 17, it's a coincidence. It doesn't mean anything. There's no real conclusion to draw there. But QAnon really relies on these epiphanies, which is, conclusions drawn from dots that have no business being connected. And so it does this in a way that's kind of self-fulfilling. QAnon can never really be proven wrong because, if you haven't figured out what it means, you've just gathered the wrong evidence. You've just put the puzzle together wrong. And so it's really putting the pressure on the participants to keep the movement alive. And they do so really excitedly. And sometimes Q will put out a date and they'll think, this is the date of the storm. The storm is the day when the good guys are supposed to take down the deep state. Right. The deep state will fall. And, Q will put forth a date and Anons will get very excited and the date will come and nothing will happen. And then instead of losing faith in Q and in QAnon, they'll think to themselves, well, what did we get wrong? How did we decode this puzzle incorrectly? Let's go back to the drawing board. And it becomes a really obsessive hobby for a lot of them. But every once in a while, something will happen that validates their beliefs and kind of brings faith back to the movement. And, one of the Anons or one of these patriots, ordinary people, had posted on this message board at one point saying, Q, if you really know Donald Trump, if you really are who you say you are, you need to prove yourself. You need to make him say the words tippy top. And just such a random phrase, right? Yeah. Like, okay. And he does. Yeah, sure enough. A couple months later, Donald Trump is at some Easter event at the White House, and he says, something along the lines of like, we're at this beautiful house and we're keeping it in tippy-top shape. And to the QAnon community, this was amazing. Yeah. This meant that, sure enough, Q was who Q said he or she was. And really, it just, for Matt, that was a really, really important moment, too, because there was still this doubt in his head. But once that happened, it's like, wow, why else would the president of the United States use the word tippy top if not a directive from Q as a private signal to the community?
Jesselyn Cook, she's a journalist, a writer, a lecturer. Her book is The Quiet Damage, QAnon and the Destruction of the American Family. We'll take a break, come back in a moment. You're listening to Radio West. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Today, a conversation for those who lost someone down a rabbit hole of conspiracy thinking or to an obsession with extreme cable content. We're talking with the journalist Jesselyn Cook about her book, where she tells the story of 5 families torn apart by the QAnon conspiracy theory. But this isn't just about QAnon. It's a look at why people believe the unbelievable and how outlandish falsehoods can take hold even when the facts are right there. Cook says for most of these believers, the truth is almost beside the point. Her book is called The Quiet Damage. I want to ask you about the role of trauma in how the story plays out. Because it seems like in every one of the 5 families, the 5 characters in the book, sometimes it's physical trauma or a threat or something in the case of a woman named Doris, a misdiagnosis. But there's some moment that happens. Is that a kind of trigger in some way? Is that the way to sort of think about it? It is in some way. And then not just a physical trauma, but also it's also about emotional trauma too, and the way they are or not able to process the emotional dynamics of all of that, that somehow make their way into believing in this thing.
Yeah, trauma makes people vulnerable. It can leave people kind of searching for a crutch, a coping mechanism. Conspiracy theories can serve in that way, absolutely. And we do see it again in the book. For Doris, the older woman you mentioned, she has this cancer misdiagnosis, and it instills in her this really deep distrust of the medical system, and it does seem like she had a pretty abusive doctor or a not very ethical doctor who tried to lie to her, convince her she had cancer and convince her to do all of these expensive treatments. And so that really just caused her to feel this terror that extended to the medical field at large. But, it led her into this world on Facebook. She was looking for other people with similar stories, and she found this whole alternative wellness community that eventually algorithmically steered her more and more into the fringe. But yeah, the theme of trauma is a common one throughout the book, which is where, you have these very fulfilled, well-adjusted people who would generally not be super susceptible to conspiracy theories. Maybe like Matt, they had even encountered them several times before and kind of just shrugged them off. But then they suffer some kind of trauma that creates a bit of a void in them in some sense. And conspiracy theories can fill that void in different ways. And for Emily, Adam's mother, the mother whose husband had taken his life, she had this trauma and she just never treated it. She just kind of harbored it, and it grew privately. And then finally, QAnon became that outlet for her.
Let's talk about Alice and what's going on with her. She's a diehard Bernie Sanders supporter, environmentalist. She lives in the Bay Area. I mean, she almost fits a liberal type. And the fact that she ends up with QAnon is a really interesting story. Tell us a little bit about Alice.
She's someone who just had a lot of fear and anxiety about the world, and all rooted in realities. She saw the planet was being really polluted. She saw that there was a lot of real corruption, whether it was big pharma or other systems of governance. The world as she saw it was not as she wanted it to be. Right. And she just has such a truly big heart. She wanted to make it a better place. She also had a young son, and she wanted the world to be a good place for him to grow up in. And Bernie Sanders gave her so much hope. She really saw him as this once-in-a-generation politician who could, change the system. And when he lost back in 2016, she was really devastated. And, she had some very legitimate questions around what happened with the DNC and why she felt he didn't have a fair shot, and that the system had been rigged against him. And this was so devastating. She really lost her hope. And in a very weird sense, QAnon gave it back to her. She was not doing super well when she encountered QAnon. This was early in the pandemic. Right. She was terrified. She had elderly parents, and she didn't know if they were going to be okay. One of her dad lived on this remote island. She was terrified COVID would ravage that island. If you think back to the earliest days of the pandemic, we had a lot of questions and we did not have a lot of answers. We didn't know how deadly the virus might be. We didn't know if there was a cure or a way to prevent it. And so she was terrified and desperate for answers. And QAnon had them. QAnon, like other conspiracy theories, really thrives in times of uncertainty, because when people are desperate for answers that cannot yet be provided, scientists were racing to study the coronavirus, but they didn't know everything. And QAnon doesn't have to wait for facts and answers. It can just stir up its own version of events and serve it to you immediately. And so it filled this information void really effectively. It gave people answers about where the virus came from, what was going to happen, who was behind it, all these evil forces at play. But what really enamored her was the vision of the future that QAnon sold her. It was one of hope. QAnon paints this image of a beautiful world that is possible, one without corruption, one without evil, without pollution, without harm to children, without war. It will be this utopia. And it was just so gripping for her. And so with time and with some persuasive propaganda and with a lot of desperation on her end and desperation for hope, something to feel hopeful about, she finds herself flipping all the way from Bernie Sanders left to QAnon far right.
I think one of the most instructive parts of the book in terms of how to deal with someone close to you who's sort of tumbled down this rabbit hole is her father and the way he reacts, Alice's father, Ted. She asks him – you tell the story about – she asks him to watch this video that she's convinced – it's the thing that gets her really going. It's called The Fall of the Cabal. And so he watches it, and his reaction and the way he treats her, I wanted you to talk about, because he doesn't buy it. He said, I think it's the work of a highly intelligent conspiracy theorist. And of course her, as you say in the book, her heart sinks when she hears this. But he also says this, I'm quoting from the book, no matter how far apart we may drift from time to time in terms of thoughts and beliefs, you, of course, have my unswerving adoration and devotion, my darling. Will you talk about that reaction? Because as you say in the book, he doesn't try to correct her. He doesn't try to get into a debate, which others do in some of these other stories. What's going on with Ted?
He's a really kind and intelligent man, and he recognizes that, his daughter is not doing well. She's latching on to something that to him is plainly absurd and terrifying. But he has this concern that if he shames her, if he ridicules her, if he tells her she's terrible for believing in QAnon, she's just going to disappear deeper and deeper into this QAnon community, which wholeheartedly accepts her. But Ted, instead of getting caught up in the true and the false and trying to debunk her new belief system, he just wants to be a hand she can hold on to in reality. He wants to keep her there. He wants her to know that he loves her. And it's such an easy thing to overlook. But unless you keep that door open, unless you give conspiracy theorists an exit route, they're not going to come back. They need to know that they can emerge from this movement still being loved, still being respected, still being treated as someone who is good and kind. Or else why would they ever come out? A lot of this becomes at a certain level about ego. And even if you're trying to help, if you tell someone that they're an idiot and they're hateful and whatever it may be because they believe in QAnon, even if at some point they realize, wait a minute, I've been duped. This isn't true. QAnon is not real. How can they come out of it? They've burned all their bridges. And Ted, Alice's father, wants to make sure she has a soft place to land if and when she's ready to emerge. And so he wants to make sure she knows that someone else still loves her.
Which is an interesting contrast to something that Adam is trying to do with his mother, Emily, who he adores, is inspired by. The reason he goes into is the legal profession. And one of the things he does, you describe in the book, is he tries what in the legal field is called the best evidence rule with his mother. She's sending him this nonsense, and he figures, I'm gonna be able to fix this with evidence, with facts. And I just wanted to you've sort of mentioned this before, but I kind of want to underscore this point, because one of the things you've talked about is the truth is almost beside the point.
Yeah, poor Adam. He decides he's going to dive down the rabbit hole after his mother because, again, he's determined not to lose a second parent after losing his dad to suicide. And so he starts consuming all the same content his mom is seeing, and he tries to educate himself on all these ideas that QAnon has so that he can be ready to debunk them when they speak next. And, he reminds her that she's a lawyer and that lawyers recognize that original evidence is the best kind of evidence, because she's sending him screenshots of supposed depositions and stuff from inside QAnon world. And he'll say, Mom, this is not an actual court document, or this is not a real, you're just sending me screenshots of stuff you find on Twitter. Let's use your lawyer brain. And rather than breaking through to her in the way he hopes, he actually ends up pushing her further away. She really digs in her heels. Yeah. She defends her views, and she starts kind of turning on him and getting kind of cruel towards him and saying, if you are too thick-headed to see that you're being lied to by the mainstream media, then I can't help you. You're you're stupid, you're not the son I raised. And, this is inching toward the really cruel letters she ends up sending him, the emails. But Adam, just using his logical mind, is just trying to tackle her falsehoods with facts. And unlike Ted, who approaches Alice with love and patience and understanding, Adam ends up really just driving a wedge between himself and his mom.
You say the thing that beneath these crazy beliefs isn't a desire to be accurately informed. They want to be comforted. What do you mean?
I think QAnon and other belief systems like it can do so much for people that has nothing to do with the facts, nothing to do with whether or not people believe facts. It's just how it makes them feel. For Matt, it made him feel like he mattered again. For Emily, it made her feel good to have a place to channel her anger. It made her feel like she had a new community at a time when she was in a very isolated scenario. In Alice, QAnon gave her hope. It gave her a reason to look forward to the future instead of feeling fear about it. And so it's important when you're trying to think about how to get someone out of these belief systems, you need to understand the true reason they're holding on.
Jesselyn Cook. Her book is The Quiet Damage, QAnon and the Destruction of the American Family. We'll take another break and come back in a moment. You're listening to Radio West. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Back now to our conversation with the journalist Jesselyn Cook. We're talking about her book, The Quiet Damage. An important part of the book is the way forward. You say the way to think about this is that we're facing, as much as a disinformation crisis, we're facing a wellness crisis. Talk a little bit about that, and then let's sort of get to some of the interventions that might deal with that wellness crisis, as you put it.
Yeah, I mean, some of the change that we really need to see has to happen at a higher level. We need to have people in power who are going to empower the working class and are going to make changes where families of all backgrounds can actually succeed and thrive and, don't have very legitimate reasons to have not just suspicion and skepticism, but outright distrust of their government. We need to see some real changes that can help people have faith in the systems that govern us. But what I really mean is, the reason that fact-checking doesn't work, that I don't think media literacy is the full answer either, or even tech regulation, is these things, they're, again, treating the symptom, not the cause. We really, if you have someone who you love who is latching on to these wild ideas and kind of building an identity around them, as many of the people in the book do, we need to get to the wellness issue beneath the delusions and understand what it is that's really driving this, why they are drawn to these ideas in the first place, and how to kind of treat that issue. Therapy, of course, is very important. Mm-hmm. Just having a full, balanced life is very important. And it sounds simple, but as we see in the book, and as I saw again and again in reporting scenarios that I didn't put into the book, the people who get out, it's not like they finally wake up to reality or they finally just shake the nonsense out of their head. That's never what happens. You can't help them with books.
Right.
People recover from this and move forward and kind of reintegrate into reality when they start doing better, when they start having this void in them, whatever it may be, fulfilled in a healthy way. But there are a couple interventions in Alice's story specifically that are really interesting that I'm happy to talk about as well.
Please do.
So Alice's then fiance, now husband, Christopher, is really concerned about Alice's kind of descent into the QAnon space. He's a very educated guy. He views Alice to be a smart person, but he's having a hard time understanding how she could be spouting such ludicrous stuff. And so he turns to his therapist, because Christopher sees a therapist semi-regularly, and he says, what do I do? And his therapist, while not a specialist in this kind of mental health issue, he first starts by saying to Christopher, well, one question you need to ask yourself is if Alice never comes back from QAnon, will you still love her? Do you still want to be with her? And Christopher wasn't sure. He really didn't know if he could be with someone indefinitely who had such a different version of reality and now new and different set of values than he did. He gave himself a deadline to kind of try to extricate her from this movement. And if they couldn't get there, he was going to walk away from the relationship. And it was painful, but it was good for him to kind of set realistic expectations for himself. And then the other piece of wisdom that his therapist shared with him was to try what would be known as the Socratic method, right, which was rather than trying to correct Alice's version of events, work with her, become partners in finding the truth, and try to help her critically assess her own ideas. And what that looks like in practice was Christopher spent some time with her kind of watching these QAnon videos together, watching these podcasts, these little tidbits of intel from Q, and kind of showing a real willingness to open his mind to them. And to Alice, this was incredible. She had, though the things she was seeing were false, the fears she had were so real. And that's important to remember. She, for example, truly, truly believed that the vaccine would kill people. And Christopher wanted to get vaccinated. So this was terrifying to her. And so rather than saying, how could you be so stupid? He said, well, all right, let's look at this stuff together from QAnon. And, because he was working with her, she became way less defensive. She was so excited to have someone who was willing to put in the work with her. And they came across some inconsistencies. There was one video that would say, vaccines are going to insert microchips into your body so that the government can track you and can control you, and mind control you. And then there was another video that said, no, the vaccine is going to be used for mass extermination. Everyone who takes it will drop dead. And, Christopher, rather than saying like, well, that's dumb, he'd say like, well, that doesn't really add up. What do you think about that? And she was able to recognize like, yeah, that is inconsistent. And it sounds like such a small thing, but it was a little victory for him. And it started to kind of plant this doubt in her mind. And so they would have these little moments like that. And it really quickly became a lot. So he took another step as advised by his therapist, which ended up being really, really valuable, which was to set boundaries. Yeah. And so he told Alice, like, I will do this with you, but it can't be every day. It can't be the second I get off work, you're sending me a dozen videos. We can have one night a week. And so one night a week, she was still happy to have someone to do this with her. And it forced her to kind of be more selective in the content she would share. Rather than the most extreme stuff, she would choose some more digestible videos and they would look at them together. And it also re-stimulated her critical thinking skills because, she had seen the ways that Christopher had very gently and thoughtfully poked holes in some of the content they had assessed. So she would try to pre-bunk it herself. She would kind of like stress test these videos before sharing them with him. And she did kind of recognize some inconsistencies herself. And then on the other side, Ted, Alice's father, was adopting a method known as motivational interviewing. And what he was trying to have Alice see and recognize was not that her ideas were false, but that they were really harming her life. He wanted her to recognize that her conspiracy theories had isolated her from her friends. They were causing people to view her really negatively. They were risking her relationship with her son. They were causing her immense stress. They were causing so much harm to her life. And so he would ask her, like, maybe this is true. Maybe it's not. But is it worth it? And he encouraged her to really, like, focus on herself and to think about her own needs, to spend some time offline, to plant a garden, to go outside, go on a walk, like just tune out the news and the politics and the theories for a while. And the more she thought about it and the more she considered the damage she was doing to her own life, she realized, well, maybe I do need to take a pause. I'm not convinced that it's false. I'm not convinced that QAnon isn't true, but I'm going to take a little break. And that did so much for her. It dialed down the fear in her life. It gave her a minute to breathe. And with Christopher kind of being there, her fiance being there to kind of gently chip away at the falsehoods in the background, this gave her the time she needed to start inching toward an exit.
You describe it as being about storytelling, that the process is kind of gently chipping away at the fantasy while you help the person reach a point where they can begin to rewrite their story in real life.
Yeah, and that is a really difficult thing to do, but perhaps Matt's story, the father of two, the religious man, his story illustrates it really well because his story was rewritten for him in a sense. He had seen himself as this great dad and husband, and then suddenly he was needing to be taken care of rather than doing the caring himself, and he felt very stripped of his identity. And so he builds a new one in QAnon, and his story is really quite tragic. You know, his whole world, as a result of his beliefs and the actions he takes in pursuit of them, it causes his world to crumble. You know, he secretly invests his family's life savings into silver and gold coins because the QAnon world has convinced him that there's going to be this financial reset and cash will be worthless and you need to barter with silver and gold. And so he takes all these kind of material steps based on lies he's been fed. And this collapses his marriage. It collapses his relationship with his kids. It kind of bankrupts him, and it destroys his life in a really way that feels like it can't be recovered. And so Matt ultimately attempts suicide, and he is unsuccessful. And he comes out on the other side and feels, you know, I guess I have this second shot at life. I guess I need to look at the mess I've made around myself and decide how I want to put the pieces back together. And eventually, the story he decides to tell for himself is not that he's going to be a QAnon patriot or a digital soldier. He decides to retell his story being the parent and the partner in a new relationship that he knows he's capable of being. And so he ends up having a stronger relationship with his son and his daughter than he did in the first place. He meets this incredible new woman, and they start to plan a life together. And he realizes, like, this is where I can truly find my purpose. This is where I can have my story go. And this is more satisfying and fulfilling to me than being a digital soldier ever was.
Let me ask you finally, for those listening who have parents or kids who they see trapped in this mindset, and not just QAnon, but maybe they're obsessed with one particular cable news channel and one particular way of thinking, where do you recommend they start?
You know, similar to the advice that Christopher's therapist gave him about Alice, the first thing would be to just have an honest conversation with yourself and decide, like, is this relationship something I want to invest the time in to try to save? Mm-hmm. And past that point, I would say really try to put your assumptions aside and put your pride aside a little bit and do some of the work that Christopher and Ted did, which is, you know, rather than trying to fact check or persuade or convince or shame, try to understand. You know, don't just ask, what do you believe, but try to understand why they believe it. And one way to do that is kind of like, how does it make you feel to believe this? You know, when Alice would talk about her beliefs about the vaccine, it became really clear to Christopher that she was just terrified, and QAnon was, you know, it was like a silver platter solution to make everything better. And so when she would talk about QAnon, she lit up the same way she would talk about Bernie. And that was kind of like a light bulb moment for Christopher. He realized, I've seen this before. I've seen you get excited in this way, and you're looking at QAnon as the antidote to evil, like you saw Bernie as the antidote to all the problems in the world. And so really just having honest, no judgment conversations, trying to understand the emotions behind the nonsense and even the anger, the defensiveness, the hostility, like, why? How does this make you feel? And then rather than targeting the information itself, you know, try to get to that underlying issue, try to get to the root vulnerability and targeting that, trying to put in work to improve their life in that way. And the other thing I would say that's really important is there's a lot of conversation about how believers, conspiracy theorists, QAnon believers need therapy, but if you are trying to bring them back to reality, you should consider it for yourself, or at the very least having a support network, because it can be really exhausting. It can be kind of maddening. It can be very painful. And in Adam's case, it was traumatizing. And he really isolated himself from everyone else in his life. He didn't have anyone to talk to about what he was going through with his mom. So if you're kind of deciding to take on this role and this journey of bringing someone you love out of a conspiracy theory or any kind of fanatical belief system, make sure you're taking care of yourself along the way. Adam's story is just a really cautionary tale of how dark things can get when you neglect your own needs.
Jesselyn Cook, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Jesselyn Cook, her book is The Quiet Damage, QAnon and the Destruction of the American Family. Radio West is a production of KUER. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. We're on YouTube at KUER 90.1. We're on Instagram at Radio West, and you can email us at radiowest@kuer.org. Our intern is Katrina Cano, the program produced by Benjamin Bombard and Tim Slover. Carrie Watson is our executive producer. I'm Doug Fabrizio.